We continue our study of the Synoptic Gospels by looking at Matthew chapter 5. Of course, we are in Matthew chapter 5 because we are studying the Sermon on the Mount. And who can remember and kind of summarize some of the stuff that we talked about last week? Where are we in the Sermon on the Mount?
Where murder begins in your heart.
Very good. Yeah, murder begins in your heart. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said by them of old, you shall not kill. Anyone who kills is in danger of the judgment." Jesus said, "But I say to you, do not be angry with your brother." Some translations saying without a cause, others omitting that. Do not even be angry with your brother, or you will be in danger of the judgment. And we talked kind of right at the very end how that murder doesn't begin with actually killing somebody. There's a process. You remember we quoted the wise sage Yoda last week when Yoda told Anakin Skywalker, he said, "I sense much fear in you, and fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to the dark side." And we talked about in the same way, when we harbor anger in our heart, that leads to general expressions of anger, and we'll touch more on this in a moment. But when we allow that to go unchecked, that leads to kind of personal outbursts of anger. And when that goes unchecked, the only fruit is murder. So murder begins not with pulling out a gun and shooting somebody, but with being angry in your heart. That's where it begins, harboring anger. So anything else? That's one part of what we talked about. We talked about all kinds of things last week. Let me ask some more pointed questions. Jesus said in verse 20, he said, "Except your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now, why was that such a shocking statement? And what do we think that Jesus was getting at when he said that?
Well, everybody thought the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, were very holy. And outwardly they were, but inwardly they were not.
Absolutely. As she says, everybody thought that they were holy, including themselves. They had the same opinion of
Probably
themselves.
more so themselves.
Yeah, they definitely had that same opinion. They agreed with the masses who thought that. And as our sister said, their righteousness was really rooted in tradition. Their righteousness was rooted in externals. And Jesus, what he's saying is that's not enough. That kind of traditional, external, religious righteousness is not the kind of righteousness that is pleasing to God. That's not the kind of righteousness which is going to get you into the kingdom of heaven. And for the rest of chapter 5, he's going to explain what it is to have a righteousness exceeding that of the scribes and the Pharisees, as he gives several examples from the law of God and how those things are to truly be understood and truly be lived out. Which brings us into verse 21, our first example. When he said, "You have heard it was said by them of old that you shall not kill. And whoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment." We talked last week about the difference between killing generally and murder. And is there a difference? And can anybody kind of summarize our discussion on that?
Yes, there's a difference. If you kill somebody because you have to, like war, which really, you just do it to protect the people, the land, or family, then that's not murder. But if you kill somebody because you're just hateful towards them and you want to kill them, then that's murder.
Right.
So it's not whatever your heart, if your heart is.
If you killed someone in a car accident, I don't think that's murder.
Yeah, she didn't mean to do it.
Right. Right. And we read from Numbers 35 where in the law of Moses it details in a form of case law. It goes over all of these examples. If you hit a man with a tool of iron so that he should die, and he dies, you're guilty of murder, and the murderer shall be put to death. If you hit a man with an instrument of wood so that he dies, and then he dies, you're guilty of murder, and you'll be put to death. And it gives all of these examples. And then it turns around and says, but, if you throw a stone on accident or without intending to hit somebody or kill somebody, and you hit them and they die, you're not necessarily guilty of murder. You're not necessarily going to be put to death. And that was the whole reason for the existence of sanctuary cities. The idea of a sanctuary city actually comes from Scripture. And a sanctuary city, or a city of refuge, is where somebody who had killed somebody could flee to, and it was the responsibility of that city to protect them until there could be a public trial. And they could determine whether or not someone was guilty of murder, or whether it was an accident, manslaughter, or whatever else. And so that's the whole point of a sanctuary city. That comes from the law of Moses, and it was to protect people who had maybe accidentally or unintentionally killed somebody from being put to death themselves.
Am I remembering wrong? That somewhere in my memory that they're also in the sanctuary city to keep that what had died family from carrying out revenge. And then also, I don't know why, but in my mind, there's a 7 years that they can stay there 7 years, and then that they can go home.
They stay there till the high priest dies.
High priest dies, okay.
So Jesus is our sanctuary city, and he's already died for us, so we are free.
But and somewhere in my mind in the scriptures, I thought I remembered 7 years, but.
Very good. Very good. So yeah, that's that. He said, and is there something significant about the way that Jesus begins his teaching when he says, "You have heard that it was said by them of old, you shall not kill." And then he goes on in verse 22 and says, "But I say unto you." Is there something significant about the words that he's using? Is there something significant about the way he is presenting this?
He's bringing up what has already been written. And so, and he's just pulling it forward. As he had done on several occasions, it has been written. And so I think that this is what he's doing here. It has been written, but without saying those words.
Yeah, it's interesting because he does actually use different words, doesn't he? We see in other places where our Lord has said, "It is written," or the Holy Spirit says, or God spoke, or certain things like this, but he's not actually using that kind of language here, is he? He's actually saying, "You have heard that it was said by them of old, by our fathers, by the ancients." And why is that significant? Was that normal, or is there something to that? Why is Jesus, speaking that way?
It looks like he's reflecting on the law back here, and as opposed to, but I say, as if he's authority.
Yeah, so Jesus, of course, was a rabbi, and the rabbinical method of teaching at this time was really to, when reflecting on the law, to begin to cite authorities. To begin to cite, well, this rabbi over here said this. This rabbi over here said that. This was the method of rabbinical teaching. And you can see this carried through even in the Talmud, which is the written oral tradition. I know that sounds kind of contradictory, but the Talmud is kind of the written oral tradition that has come down through rabbinical Judaism. And you can even see in that, like, this is how rabbis teach. As they offer something about the law, and then they say, well, this is what this rabbi said. This is what that rabbi said. This is what this school thought. This is what this school taught. And so Jesus, as a rabbi, is communicating in that same way. You have heard that it was said by them of old, thou shalt not kill. And whoever kills is in danger of the judgment. And where he switches it up is when he says, but I say unto you. Where he offers himself, as our sister said, as the authority. And this was strange. This was the difference. The first part is just like every other rabbi. It's the second part when he says, but I say unto you. Where now he's setting himself as an authority to interpret this command, thou shalt not kill. And we get Jesus' interpretation of it. And what is Jesus' interpretation? In verse 22. Because this is where we're going to kind of pick up and get moving again.
Well, it's like y'all said, something is together, it can be together. emotional reaction.
Yes, very good. And we know that because he says, I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother is in danger of the judgment. So it's not just the act of killing that puts you in danger of the judgment, but it's the act of harboring anger. And we talked about some translations say without a cause, other translations do not say without a cause. And the conclusion that I come to is it doesn't really matter. Whether your anger is justified or not, it doesn't actually, make a difference, because the fact remains, if we harbor anger in our heart, that puts us in danger of the judgment. And I was thinking about this week. I have been guilty of this, and I feel like I'm not the only one. I have always, in my mind, combined this passage with the next passage. Because in the next passage, Jesus says concerning adultery, you have heard that it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, anyone who looks after a woman in order to lust after her has committed adultery in his heart. So he's guilty of the sin of adultery by lusting after a woman in his heart. And I have always taken that and read it back into this conversation about anger and murder. So as to say, anyone who is angry with his brother without a cause is guilty of murder in his heart. But he doesn't actually say that, does he? He doesn't say that you're guilty of murder. What does he say is the problem if you harbor anger against your brother?
Without a cause.
Without a cause. With or without a cause,
You're
right?
going to be judged.
Yeah, you'll be in danger of the judgment. So it's not necessarily saying that you have committed murder in your heart. He's saying you are in danger of the judgment. In the same way that if I walk into a bear-infested forest, I haven't necessarily been attacked by a bear. But I am in danger of being attacked by a bear because I'm in the forest, right? You are in danger of violating the command, thou shalt not kill. You are in danger of being found guilty in the court of law, not simply by killing, but just by harboring the anger in your heart. That alone puts you in danger of the judgment. And what do we mean when we say the judgment? What is that referring to? We mentioned this very briefly last week. Let's find out who's really paying attention and taking notes here. What do we mean when we say the judgment? How would we understand that in our own context? The judgment is like the court of law. So when he says you're in danger of the judgment, he's basically saying you're in danger of being found guilty. You're in danger of being charged and convicted of this particular crime. You're in danger of the judgment. And we talked last week once again about there is a progression that happens. So it begins with harboring anger, and then that is expressed a little bit further when you say rakah, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And it is expressed even further when you say thou fool. So there is a progression of more and more kind of violent outbursts of anger, violent manifestations of anger. But there is also a progression and increase in the penalty or the consequence that is associated with it. So harboring anger in your heart against your brother, whether with or without a cause, that puts you in danger of being found guilty. But what's the next proposition say? Okay, yes, whoever will say to his brother, rakah, is in danger of the council. Now, this word, rakah, is what we would call in grammar an interjection. It is notoriously difficult to translate. And again, if you were to go back and even read St. Augustine's commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, you'll see him talking about this. Someone who was a fluent Greek speaker who lived in the Roman Empire where Greek was still very prevalent. Even he was like, we don't really know what this word means. It's not a Greek word. It's not a Hebrew word. It might be an Aramaic word, but we're not really sure what it means. The best we can tell is that it is an interjection. And an interjection is just some sort of expression of strong emotion. So the word rakah was like if I was to get angry and say, dang it. Or if I was to get angry and go, ugh, something like that. Those are interjections. Go ahead.
My Bible says idiot.
Okay, idiot. Is that for the part that says rakah?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah,
Idiot.
that's someone who thinks that they have determined a translation and they're saying idiot. But even that's still a strong expression of emotion, right? It is an expression of frustration. It's an expression of anger. And that's what the word rakah is. So however we understand it, however we might translate it, just understand that that word is a general expression of anger. Okay? It's not necessarily directed at any individual. It's not necessarily, it's like, when your teenage kid punches a hole in the wall or something. This is a general expression of anger. It's not directed at an individual. It's just a spraying anger out. That's what rakah is. Okay? And he says, as our sister pointed out, whoever says rakah, whoever begins to express their anger, even in a general way, whoever expresses their anger like this, they are in danger of the council. Now, what is the council? What does that mean?
The Sanhedrin.
Yeah, the Sanhedrin, an investigative body. And you could say an investigative body of the church. But when Jesus is speaking here, he is referring specifically to the Sanhedrin. In fact, some of your translations may say Sanhedrin. Does anybody have a translation that says that?
Mine just says High Council.
The High Council. Well, what is the Sanhedrin? You might remember this in our very first lesson when we started the Synoptic Gospels. We talked about the Sanhedrin. The very first one, like 1 year and 8 months ago. So let's see who remembers for those who were here. What is the Sanhedrin?
It's a judgmental council
It's a council. It's like a court, right?
that determines.
It's the highest court in Israel. The Sanhedrin is like what we would think of the Supreme Court in a sense. The Sanhedrin was like the governing body of Israel. And the reason why he says you're in danger of the council is because when it comes to dealing out punishments, especially like capital punishments, big punishments, only the Sanhedrin had the authority to do that. So you could be judged, you could hold court and be convicted of a crime anywhere in Israel, but only the Sanhedrin had the right to sentence somebody to some form of serious punishment, like death, for instance. And even so, the Sanhedrin didn't necessarily have that authority. The person who ultimately had the authority is the governor, the Roman governor of the area. Do y'all remember Jesus, the night he was betrayed, where did they take him? Yeah, they took him to Herod, but where did they take him to be judged? The Sanhedrin. And it was in the Sanhedrin that the high priest ripped his garment and said, "You have heard the blasphemy. What other need is there for witnesses?" So they condemned him as being worthy of death on the charge of blasphemy. But then where did they take him?
Then they had to take him to Pilate.
Then they had to take him to Pilate. Yep. Then they had to take him to the Roman governor. Then they had to take him to Pilate because only the Roman governor had the authority to put somebody to death. So the Sanhedrin could find somebody worthy of death. They were the only governing body in Jerusalem that could do that. But they had to get permission from Rome in order to actually carry that out. Rome was actually the ones who carried that out. Now the Sanhedrin was a governing body, and Rome really allowed it to kind of do its thing. And if you think about it, that makes sense. If you're a Roman governor, why would you want to get involved with a bunch of people whom you know nothing about and all of their religious traditions that you don't know anything about? Why would you want to stick your nose in that when there is this existing governing body that deals with all of their own issues independently? So the Roman governor just kind of let the Sanhedrin do its thing. And that's what they did. One of the things they did was pronounce sentences. So when he says you're in danger of the council, this is the upgrade. Not only are you in danger of being found guilty, tried and convicted, but you're also in danger of being punished by the council. There is a punishment for those who express their anger in a general way, who say rakah, right? And it goes on even from there, because what does he say in the next part?
You're full of danger of hellfire.
Very good. He says, whoever shall say you fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. Now, let's talk about this expression, you fool. Again, we notice the progression. It begins with harboring anger in our heart. And that's like planting a seed. You plant the seed of anger. You plant the seed of bitterness. You plant the seed of unforgiveness. And that seed begins to grow. And it manifests itself as a plant. And it manifests itself as general expressions of anger. Rakah, being mad, slamming stuff, throwing stuff. These are all manifestations of anger that is existing in the heart. Generally. But that progresses now to you fool. This is a direct personal expression of hatred or anger toward another individual. This would be equivalent to saying, like, I hate you. This would be equivalent to saying, cussing somebody out, basically. This would be equivalent to getting right inside somebody's face and yelling and screaming at them and saying, you fool, you worthless idiot, I hate you, all this kind of stuff. That is what the idea being expressed here when he says you fool is. It's not that if you just call somebody a fool. That's not the point. Because some people are fools, and it's good to tell a fool that they're a fool, right? We can read about this in Proverbs. If somebody really is foolish, it's an act of kindness to tell them to stop being such a fool, right? So it's not simply using the words you fool. The idea being expressed here is an intense personal expression of hatred. To curse somebody. Any thoughts about that? Does that make sense? Do we agree, disagree?
It doesn't talk about being judged by man when it says you fool. It talks about being judged by God.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, so the danger is hellfire, right? The danger is hellfire. Let's talk about hellfire for a moment. Hellfire is a reference to the valley of Gehenna. Now, in the New Testament, there are two words that are translated as hell. Every time you see hell, it's one of two words. It might be the word Hades or Hades. Does anybody know what Hades is or Hades? The underworld. It's the place of the dead. It's the name of the Greek god who governs the underworld. It's the name of the underworld itself. And in Jewish thought at this time, in the underworld there was kind of two compartments. And Jesus talks about this when he talks about the rich man and the poor beggar, when they both die and they both went into the underworld. They both went to Hades. And the rich man, it says, was in Hades. He was in hell. And that was like a place of torment. That was like a place of suffering. That was, he was thirsty and hot and everything. But then there was that second compartment where the poor beggar went, and that was called Abraham's bosom. And that was like a place of peace and comfort in the underworld. So that's a reference to the underworld, but there is a distinction where the just end up in Abraham's bosom, and the unjust end up in the realm of the dead, in the place of the dead, which is a place of discomfort and torment. So we can see a picture of that even as Jesus is teaching in that. So one of the words that's translated as hell in the New Testament is the word Hades, the place of the dead, the underworld. The other word that is translated as hell in the New Testament is the word Gehenna. Gehenna. Now, what is Gehenna? Gehenna actually is a compound word, and what it means is the valley, I think, of Hemron, or the valley of Hemon, or something like that. But Gehenna is a place where, in Old Testament history, the valley of Gehenna was a place where they sacrificed children. It was a place where they worshipped Molech. They offered their children to the fire in the valley of Gehenna, which is the Greek translation of this valley of Hemron, or whatever it is. We're going to read about it in just a minute.
Hinnom.
Hinnom. Okay, yeah. The valley of Hinnom. That's the Hebrew way of saying it. And the Greek way of saying it is Gehenna. So it's the Valley of Hemon. We're going to read about this in just a second. But it was the place of idolatry. It's where they offered their children as a sacrifice. In fact, let's turn to 2 Chronicles 28 together. 2 Chronicles chapter 28. Don't read out of 2 Chronicles very often. A little trivia. Chapter 28. 2 Chronicles chapter 28, beginning in verse 1. And we'll start in just a moment. 2 Chronicles is actually the last book of the Hebrew Old Testament. So if you look at the way that Jews arrange the Old Testament scriptures, they don't arrange it the same way that we arrange it in our Bibles. They arrange it in a different way. And 2 Chronicles is part of the writings, and the book what we call 2 Chronicles is the last book in the Hebrew canon. So like when Jesus would think about the order of the books of Scripture, 2 Chronicles was the last one, the way that we would think of Revelation. So that's neither really here nor there. It's just trivia while we are looking it up. 2 Chronicles chapter 28. And remember, we are looking at this, what is translated as hell in the New Testament is a reference to the valley of Gehenna, as we say it in Greek, and it's the valley of Hinnom, I think was in Hebrew. And we're going to read about that right now. So 2 Chronicles chapter 28, will somebody please read verses 1 through 3?
Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. Unlike David his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel and also made idols for worshiping the Baals. He burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom and sacrificed his children in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites.
Okay, so we have King Ahaz, a king of Judah. And was King Ahaz a good king? No, he was a bad king. He did not walk after the ways of his father David, but what did he do?
We sacrificed his children.
For one, he sacrificed his children. Where does it say that he sacrificed his children?
In verse 3.
But what is the location?
Oh, in the valley of Ben Hinnom.
The Valley of Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom, translated into Greek as Gehenna. Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom. Gehenna. Gehenna, of course, is a word translated as hell. Now, why did the Valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna, become to be understood as hell? What is the deal with that? Well, as we just learned, this was a place of idolatry. This is a place where child sacrifice happened. But in the course of Israeli history, there would arise a good king who would conquer and would take back control of the Valley of Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom, by the way, is just southwest, or southeast rather, of Jerusalem. It's just right outside of Jerusalem. It's like right there. So this is very close by to where Jerusalem is. But this area would be conquered again by a great king, a good king, and he would eliminate all of the idol worship. And what actually ended up happening is they tore down all the idols, they tore down all the altars, they smashed it all into powder, they destroyed it all, and the Valley of Hinnom, Gehenna, became a burning garbage dump. For the rest of Israeli history, the Valley of Gehenna, or I should just say Gehenna, or the Valley of Hinnom, it became a place where they would burn refuse. It became a place where they would burn garbage. It became a place where they would burn the dead carcasses of animals. It became a place where they would burn the dead carcasses of convicted criminals. So this was a perpetual flaming dump outside of the city of Jerusalem. And this is one of the words that Jesus used in reference to hell. And some people take that and they say, so this is, hell doesn't even exist. Hell isn't a thing. Jesus just meant this over here. And then some people just completely get rid of the relevance of Gehenna altogether. But we want to be balanced. We want to understand that there is a certain imagery represented here. When Jesus talks about the smoke that is always ascending, in the valley of Gehenna, smoke was always ascending because the trash was always burning. And the place, Jesus says, where the worm dieth not, the valley of Gehenna was known for having these certain strange species of worm that wouldn't die. And that they were just constantly turning. Because of the constant burning and the flesh and the garbage, there were these great worms that were constantly mixing and they just wouldn't die. Even in the fire, the worms didn't die. The worm that dieth not, you may have read in your New Testament. All of this imagery is coming from the valley of Gehenna, a place of torment, a place of darkness, a place of unclean and hellfire, if you will. And so this word here that is translated in Matthew 5 as hellfire is the word Gehenna. That's what it is, Gehenna, the valley of Hinnom. Okay? Now let's go ahead and read about what happened here. So let's turn back to 2 Kings 23. You're going to want to go backwards to find 2 Kings 23. We're going to read about what happened to the valley of Hinnom. This is well before Jesus' day. And so there arose a righteous king. Josiah was his name. And Josiah rediscovered the book of God's law, and they read the book, and he came to repentance by reading God's law. And so Josiah began to institute some reforms in the land of Judah. Josiah began to institute some revival in the kingdom of Judah. And one of the things he did, of course, was to destroy all of these idolatrous places, and we're going to read about that right now. Let's start in 2 Kings 23. Let's start in verse 5 and read verses 5, 6, and 7 of chapter 23 of 2 Kings.
And he removed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense on the high places in the cities of Judah and in places all around Jerusalem. And those who burned incense to the sun, to the moon, to the constellations, and to all the hosts of heaven. And he brought out the wooden image from the house of the Lord to look Kidron outside of Jerusalem, burned it at the brook Kidron, and ground it to ashes, and threw its ashes on the graves of the common people. How far did you want to read?
Verse 7 as well.
Then he tore down the ritual booths of the converted persons out of the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the women.
Okay, so he's instituting these reforms in Judah, and that looks like killing all of the idolatrous priests who burned incense unto false gods and into the sun and the moon and the stars and all these things. And it looked like pulling out all of the idolatrous practices out of the temple and destroying them, grinding them into powder, casting them on the graves of the people. It looked like tearing down the houses of the prostitutes and the sodomites that were near unto the house of the Lord. Let's read verse 8, 9, and 10.
And he brought all the priests from the cities of Judah and defiled the high places where the priests had burned incense from Geba to Beersheba. Also he broke down the high places at the gate, which were the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were to the left of the city gate. Nevertheless, the priests of the high places did not come up to the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, but they ate unleavened bread among their brethren. And he defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or daughter pass through the fire to Melech.
Yes, very good. So these reforms continue, and once again, he's tearing down the high places, destroying the idolatrous temples, and it says here in verse 10 that he defiled Topheth in the valley of the children of Hinnom. In Greek, Gehenna. So this is the story of how that valley was conquered again and defiled, so that nobody ever offered their children to the fires of Molech and Gehenna again. This is the story. Josiah is the one who took that place back and defiled it. And it was at this time that it was converted into a dump, where the fire was always burning, and the smoke was always rising, and the worm dieth not, and all of that imagery that we see in the Gospels, that's right here, the Valley of Hinnom, Gehenna. Okay? So let's turn back now to Matthew chapter 5. We're going to put some of this together in our last few moments here. And then, Lord willing, next week, we're going to get into all of the application that the Lord makes, now that we have kind of worked through it and are beginning to understand, maybe at a deeper level, some of the things that he's talking about. So when we consider, and I want you to consider this in particular. Remember what I said. The Valley of Gehenna was a place where they burned the carcasses of convicted criminals. It's where they would dispose of the bodies of the crucified. It's where they would dispose of the bodies of the stoned. It's where they would dispose of the bodies of those who had been put to death as criminals. So listen now to what Jesus is saying in light of that. Whoever will say, "You fool," shall be in danger of hellfire, of being cast into the valley of Gehenna, shall be in danger of ending up in the place where they burn dead criminals. You harbor anger in your heart, and you're in danger of the judgment. You express that anger generally, and you're in danger of being condemned as worthy of death by the council. You begin to express that anger intentionally and personally, and you're in danger of ending up on that never-ending garbage heap in the valley of Gehenna as a dead, executed murderer. And you see how that progression now maybe begins to make a little bit more sense than when we were looking at it before, with all of this talk about the judgment and the council, and then where does hellfire come into this? Because our mind instantly, when we go that, takes it out of the temporal realm, the realm of time and space and the human realm, and brings us up into the heavenly realm and the divine judgment, where people end up in hell or in heaven, right? But if we're just going to follow this through, we can see the metaphor that Jesus is playing out here. And I'm not saying that there is not a spiritual overtone to this, but let's follow the earthly metaphor for a moment. You harbor anger, and you're in danger. You're in a dangerous place already. You begin expressing that anger, now you're in danger of being condemned as worthy of death. And then when you start actually being violent toward people and cursing people and expressing anger in that kind of violent way, you're in danger of ending up as a dead criminal in the valley of Gehenna, burning with the garbage in the dump. So we see, when we look at this, once again, the danger of killing is not simply the danger of being found guilty in court. The rabbis, the teachers, the men of old, they said, "You shall not kill, for if you kill, you will be in danger of the judgment." And Jesus says, you're not in danger of the judgment by killing somebody. You're in danger of the judgment way before that. In fact, before you ever kill somebody, you're in danger of ending up naked and dead in the valley of the dump, where the fire burns forever as a convicted criminal without ever killing anybody. And the Pharisees had this idea that they were righteous because they had never killed anybody. I would never kill anybody. And what Jesus is doing is kind of stripping that aside and saying the point is not that you're killing somebody. See, we're misunderstanding all of this. You're setting the fence far too close to the edge. For the command, truly, not to kill, goes deeper than that. It goes to the attitude of the heart. It goes to not even harboring anger against your brother. Because once again, the only way you can get to killing is by first harboring the anger. You don't jump from here to there. There's a process that happens. And if you set the fence way back here where you refuse to even harbor anger against somebody, you will never be in danger of killing. Because you won't ever give place for that to rise. It's like if you just keep pulling that weed as it grows up. It'll never grow into a full-grown thistle because you're plucking it every time it sprouts its head. You don't even let it take root. You don't even let it begin to germinate and to grow. You're plucking it out already. So any thoughts about everything that we've talked about in verse 21 and 22? Any other insights or any thoughts? Have you learned something new? What do y'all think about what we just said in those couple of verses?
I think for myself, the explanation of murder in the hurt versus if you're in war and you're fighting to save yourself, your comrades, your country, your friends, whatever, that cleared things.
Good. Very good. Yeah, if you're more interested in that topic, you can look up what's called just war theory. And that kind of extends even beyond just war, but it's the idea of justified violence generally. When is violence justified and when is violence necessary? That all falls kind of under the study of just war theory. So if that's a topic you're interested in continuing to explore, look that up. Again, St. Augustine is one of the first people to ever talk about this, and it has been developed over the centuries even more. So there's a lot there you can look at. Anything else?
Well, off this topic, on to what you had said, my mother, did always had a problem with the Old Testament of God telling Israelites to go in and basically genocide these evil people, evil in God's eyes, and then take their land, but even the children. And so she always had a problem with that, with taking lives of who she considered to be innocent. And so I was curious of your thoughts on that.
My thoughts are God did not consider them to be innocent.
I have a different thought process on that.
Okay.
What do you do with the orphans?
I'm sorry.
What would you do with the orphans? You kill their parents and now you raise these children. They're going to hate you because you killed their parents. And you're going to want them to give up everything they've been taught to become Jewish. Otherwise, they're not going to be allowed to marry into the Jewish family. It would have created so much trouble trying to raise those children to not be hateful and resentful, that just as a matter of practicality, to keep all of the gods out, their false gods, their bad ways, and we don't even know how well do they speak the same language. And if you're busy trying to take over the land, who's going to have time to try to deal with these traumatized children? It was kind of a just start with a clean slate. Now, I don't think God judged them going to hell. They were children. He may have had a special place in heaven for them, maybe. But as far as thinking about the Israelites staying pure and not having other gods and other problems, they already had enough trouble. Look at how often that God was like, again, we're going to go do this again. Okay, well, let me tell you again, you're going to be judged if you don't straighten up. Because at what age do you decide they're too difficult to raise? 5, 10?
Well, with I think the extremes of thou shalt not kill, and yet he's telling y'all, Helen, it was different times, you know, in some ways, but yet.
There's also a theory out there that some of these people were hybrids between fallen angels and humans, and they needed to be gotten out of the gene pool. That's one of the theories out there.
And to offer a little bit fuller explanation, as our sister kind of pointed out, and what this was getting at, is some people have thought of this kind of as a work of mercy toward these children, because not only do you have the practical problem of what do you do with all these orphans, but a bunch of orphaned kids, they were going to live destitute lives of slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So some people have said, well, this is a work of mercy by killing all these people. Some people who believe in the idea of age of accountability say, well, they kill all these children and they automatically go into heaven because they were all children, And so it's a work of mercy, actually, to kill. There's mercy found in the judgment. Now, to offer my own perspective a little more fully is this. God was using the Israelites as his tool of judgment against the people in the land of Canaan. Their cup had become full. It was time for them to be judged as God judges nations, and he used the Israelites as his tool of judgment upon the people who lived in the land of Canaan. That's what he did. In the same way that he used Assyria as a tool in his hand to judge the Israelites when their cup had come to the full. So God used the Israelites as a tool of judgment to execute his own righteous judgment on the people of Canaan. And, a lot of people don't like that. A lot of people don't like the idea, like you said, it was your mother, I believe, who doesn't like that idea. But the reality is, in God's estimation, what he did obviously was warranted, and what he did was necessary, and he did it, which means it was good, because everything God does is good. And I never want to myself be in a position where I'm putting God in the docket and sitting in judgment of how he acts in time. I'm far too ignorant to judge God's mind when it comes to executing judgment in the world. That's what happened in the land of Canaan. This is very clear from Scripture. God used Israel as a weapon in his hand to bring his own divine judgment against those people living in Canaan. And he used the Israelites to wipe them out. And we talked a little bit about it even last week. One of the roles of the state, of a governing authority, is to wield the sword, is to punish the evildoer, is to execute the criminal. And this is one of the legitimate roles of government. And so God is the governor of the universe, who is always just and always righteous and always good, used the people of Israel to execute his judgment against those people in Canaan. So that might not be an emotionally satisfactory answer, but it is a true one.
They also had the forewarning. I mean, you're bringing up 1 million or so people. Mm-hmm. Everybody knew they were coming. God put fear into people's hearts because they were coming. They could have moved.
Well, and also, if you think about it too, the prophets were sent ahead. For the longest, warning people.
Well, think of the one story, even in the middle of that, of Rahab, the prostitute, the mistress, the keeper of the brothel, who lived in Jericho. Her and her entire family were saved because of their faith in God, expressed in kindness toward the spies, right? And as a result of that, even though the entire city of Jericho fell, and every man, woman, child, and beast in the city was put to death, that woman and her family weren't, because they believed God. And so by their faith, they were saved from the judgment that came upon the land of Jericho. And Rahab was actually in the lineage of Jesus Christ. So God works all these things out. Any other thoughts or questions or comments? Next week we're going to start getting into, okay, how do we apply this? We've seen the tradition said if you kill your neighbor, you're in danger of being judged. What Jesus is saying is it starts way back here at harboring anger. If you want to be righteous with the kind of righteousness that will get you into the kingdom of heaven, it doesn't start with thou shalt not kill. It starts with thou shalt not harbor anger in your heart towards your brother. That's a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees. That's a righteousness that is acceptable in the kingdom of heaven. And if that's true in the material world, if all of the things that we said using Jesus' own metaphor, if all of that is true in the material world, how much more true is it in the spiritual world? How much more in danger of perfect, righteous, holy judgment from the one who can read our hearts and know our thoughts are we if we're harboring anger and expressing anger and hating our brothers? We will be in danger of not the valley of Gehenna, hellfire, but of hellfire, right? If it's true in the material world, it is also true in the spiritual. We must be those who have a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees. It's not enough to simply not kill. If you want to truly be righteous, if you want to truly honor this commandment put out by God, you must not even harbor anger in your heart. Go ahead.
Next week, maybe we should spend a little time on how to get rid of anger.
That would be good. That would be good. Because Jesus, again, he gave the teaching in 3 verses, and now there's 3 verses dedicated to application. So we spent 2 weeks examining the teaching. It might be necessary for us to spend 2 or 3 weeks examining the application. How can we live this out now? And that's going to be the question definitely next week, maybe even more going into the future. How can we live this out? This is the standard. This is what Jesus has said. How do we then live it? Very good. Anything else as we come to a close?
I experienced my first episode of road rage. I was, for some reason, I'll never know the reason, they come around me and got in front of me and brake locked.
Uh-huh.
And I'll never know why they were angry. That's the bad thing about road rage is, it just, why? I had to have done something.
Scared me to death.
Yeah, I had to have done something to aggravate them, but what was it I did? I can't correct it if I don't know what it was.
Yeah.
So road rage is really bad.
Yeah.
And when the little bitty car.
Yeah. Gonna get smacked. Yeah, that kind of outburst of anger is never rational. It never makes sense. It never makes sense. That's why it's so that anger can be dangerous. You cannot let anger control you. We must be self-controlled. We cannot let anger control us because it turns us into crazy people. Anything else? Very good. Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Charlie, will you close us in prayer this evening?